They laughed when Janet Calloway, 76 years old, pressed that brass compass to her chest and walked into the forest like she already knew something no one else did. In Mill Haven, people had decided what she was long ago: stubborn, old-fashioned, too attached to land and stories nobody else believed in anymore. The mining company saw her as even less than that. Just one more elderly holdout standing between them and the valley beneath her feet. Their lawyers joked about how long she would last out there alone. Her neighbors shook their heads and called it sad. Her own family worried she had finally confused memory for reality. But Janet was not confused. And she was not lost. Because the compass in her hands did not point north. It pointed toward a secret her father buried in the mountains 80 years earlier, a secret built by minds far ahead of their time, and protected by patience, stone, and silence until the right person was ready to find it. 3 days later, Janet came back out of that forest carrying no gold, no weapons, and no visible triumph. What she brought instead was more dangerous than any of that: proof. Proof that the mountain had been hiding an empire of value all along. And proof that the old woman everyone dismissed had understood the map long before anyone else even realized there was one. Mill Haven, Montana was the kind of town people passed through without meaning to remember. It sat tucked between two mountain ranges, small and weathered, with one blinking traffic light, a general store older than most of its customers, and the particular quiet of a place that had learned to survive disappointment without making a spectacle of it. Population 840, said the sign on the road in, though Janet Calloway suspected that number had been optimistic for years. She had lived there for 51 years. Long enough to know which houses still held the same curtains from 1989, which fences would survive another winter, and which stories people kept repeating because they had nothing newer to trust. Long enough, too, to stop confusing noise with importance. Janet's house sat on 12 acres at the edge of town where the federal forest began. It needed paint. The gutters had been on her list for 3 years. The barn was full of her late father's journals, maps, and research papers. None of that bothered her much. At 76, Janet had become very clear about what mattered and what merely demanded attention. What mattered was the compass. Every morning, she set it on the kitchen table beside her coffee in the same beam of eastern light. It was brass, hand-engraved, worn smooth where her fingers had touched it over decades. On one side was a mountain ridgeline she knew by heart. On the other were the words, "For the one who knows how to listen." Her father had placed it in her hands when she was 18 and told her not to use it until she understood what it was. It had taken her 30 years to understand. Elliot Calloway had never been the kind of man who explained himself just because other people were curious. Janet learned that early. Her father was a geologist, but not the comfortable, predictable kind universities like to produce. He found things other experts missed. Water where surveys said there was none. Mineral formations mapped with a precision that should not have been possible with the tools available in his era. Men in suits respected him just enough to use his work, and distrusted him just enough to avoid asking how he did it. Janet grew up watching him disappear into the mountains for days at a time. He brought back crates of equipment, strange correspondence, coded notes, and the kind of silence that meant his mind was occupied by something too large to explain casually. She knew, even as a girl, that he was building something. Not a cabin. Not a mine. Something stranger. Something important. Then he died. Before he did, he gave Janet the compass. Not as a keepsake, but as an instruction deferred. For decades, she carried that instruction without fully understanding it. Meanwhile, the journals waited in the barn, 43 of them, dense with technical notes, coded language, maps, references to collaborators across multiple states, and repeated hints about a project hidden in the mountains. Janet spent 30 years decoding them bit by bit, page by page, refusing to rush what her father had clearly intended to be understood only with time. And 4 months ago, she reached the final journal. That was when the fragments finally locked together. The compass was not symbolic. It was a key. Just as Janet finished decoding the final journal, the outside pressure arrived. Harrow Extraction came into Mill Haven the way companies like that always do, smiling first, threatening later. They sent letters. Then representatives. Then lawyers in expensive shoes who stood on old porches talking about opportunity, growth, and responsible development as if changing the vocabulary could change what they wanted. What they wanted was the valley. More specifically, they wanted the mineral rights beneath it. Their opening offers sounded generous to people who had spent years watching the town shrink. $40,000 an acre for rights most families had never expected to money eyes. Enough to pay debts. Enough to buy trucks. Enough to make hard winters feel less dangerous. So people signed. Clarence Bigg signed. The Henderson signed. Even old Tom Waverley, who had once sworn he would never let a corporation touch his land, signed after the number got big enough. Janet did not. That refusal made her an object of fascination and irritation almost overnight. Neighbors called her stubborn. The lawyers called her unrealistic. Harrow's representatives came back again and again with better offers and thinner patience. Each time, Janet sat at her kitchen table with the brass compass in the morning light, listened without interruption, poured coffee if they stayed long enough, and declined. Politely. Firmly. Repeatedly. To everyone else in Mill Haven, it looked like an old woman clinging to pride, memory, or superstition. But Janet was not refusing because she feared change. She was refusing because she already knew the mountain held something more valuable than anything Harrow thought it was buying. The hardest pressure did not come from Harrow's lawyers. It came from family. Janet's son Michael called first, trying to sound reasonable. Then her grandchildren, Daniel and Cora, drove up from Billings on a Saturday with concern written all over their faces and impatience hidden just beneath it. They sat at her kitchen table, the compass between them like an accusation, and spoke in the careful language people use when they think someone older needs to be managed gently. They told her the company's offer was practical. They told her the house needed work. They told her the town was changing whether she liked it or not. What they did not say outright, but what Janet heard anyway, was that they thought she was clinging to something imaginary because age had made her too sentimental to see reality. Janet listened to every word. Then she looked at them, at the people she loved, and asked for the one thing no one had yet offered her. Trust. Not agreement. Not blind obedience. Just trust that she knew the difference between confusion and conviction. They left unconvinced. That evening, Janet carried the final journal onto the back porch and read the last decoded page again in the fading light. It described a journey of 3 days, a hidden entrance, and the final instructions her father had never spoken aloud. Then she picked up the compass. It settled in her hand with that faint, unmistakable pull toward the mountain. Not north. Not any ordinary direction. The third direction. Janet looked at the tree line, felt the years of waiting gather into one clean certainty, and went inside to pack. Janet left before sunrise, not because she was afraid someone would stop her, but because some journeys begin more honestly before the world starts talking. The air was sharp with late spring cold, and the eastern sky had only just begun to pale when she crossed the tree line with her pack, her map, and the brass compass tucked close where she could reach it quickly. She carried no phone. No one in town would have called that wise, which was one of several reasons she did not bother explaining it. Cell service ended in the first stretch of forest anyway. Dead weight had no place in her pack. The first day's walk was not easy, but it was familiar. She followed the creek bed for miles, moving at the steady, economical pace of someone who understood that endurance mattered more than speed. Janet had been walking these mountains in one form or another for most of her life. She knew where the ground looked stable but wasn't, where deer paths could be mistaken for usable routes, and which slopes held water late into spring. She did not waste motion. She did not rush. The compass remained mostly calm that day. Every hour or so, she stopped, checked the needle, and read not only its orientation but its stillness. Her father had taught her, through journals rather than conversation, that the instrument communicated in degrees. Direction was only part of its language. Near dusk, that language changed. The needle gave its first faint vibration. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to tell Janet she was nearing what her father had once called a resonant zone, and that the mountain had started answering back. The second day was where the mountain stopped feeling familiar. By morning, Janet had climbed above the easier terrain and into old-growth timber so dense it swallowed light and flattened distance. The trail, if it had ever truly been a trail, dissolved into steep switchbacks, root tangles, and slopes slick with old needles. This was not the kind of ground that rewarded speed. It punished assumptions. But Janet did not move like someone trying to conquer the mountain. She moved like someone listening to it. And the compass was no longer still. The needle began to spin briefly, then settle, then spin again as she crossed certain sections of ground. Janet checked it every 20 minutes, not nervously, but attentively, learning the rhythm between the instrument's behavior and the terrain beneath her feet. Her father had written that by this stage, the mountain would begin speaking through structure. She understood now what he meant. The signs were subtle. A sudden change in undergrowth density. A patch of soil darker than the land around it. The way sound carried differently when she struck her boot against rock. By midday, she found the first unmistakable marker, a hillside where the same species of plants were growing, but growing stronger, taller, more vigorous than they should have been. Exactly the pattern described in one of Eliot's journals. Janet stopped, took a careful reading, and looked toward what appeared to be an ordinary rock face. Ordinary, that is, if you did not know how to read what the mountain was hiding. By the time she made camp that evening, she knew one thing with certainty: she was close. Janet found the door on the third morning, but only because she stopped looking for a door. What stood ahead of her appeared, at first glance, to be nothing more than a weathered rock face beneath the roots of an old Douglas fir. The tree was massive, older than anyone in Mill Haven, its roots gripping the mountain like the fingers of something that had no intention of letting go. To anyone else, it was just forest and stone. But Janet had her father's journals. And she had the compass. At a very specific angle, with the early light striking from the east just as Eliot had described, the lie in the landscape revealed itself. What looked like a natural striation across the rock was too straight. What looked like a fracture line was too clean. And the roots of the tree, instead of breaking the pattern, were actually helping hide it. Janet set down her pack and worked slowly. She cleared loose debris and packed soil from the base of the formation with the folding tool she had brought for exactly this purpose. 40 years of weather and 80 years of growth had done their best to erase the outline, but they had not succeeded. At knee height, just to the right of the seam, she found the recessed stone her father had described. Behind it was a socket. Exactly the size of the brass compass. Janet held it for one quiet moment, thinking of the hand that had first placed it in hers, then pressed it into the mechanism. Deep inside the mountain, something old awakened. A sequence of clicks. A shift of pressure. And then, with the smooth certainty of something built to wait, the hidden door swung inward. Janet stepped through the doorway expecting confirmation. What she found was scale. A narrow passage sloped downward for about 30 feet, cool and dry, the air carrying that preserved, mineral stillness of a place sealed far longer than a human body is meant to imagine. Then the tunnel opened, and Janet stopped walking. The chamber was enormous. Not a cave. Not a cache. A built space, deliberate, engineered, reinforced. The ceiling curved in a concrete arch. The walls were lined with sealed storage bays and glass-fronted cabinets that had somehow held their integrity across decades. Tables stood where they had been left. Instruments rested under covers. Shelves were packed with labeled containers and neatly ordered files. Nothing about it felt improvised. It felt like a future paused mid-breath. Janet moved slowly, reading as she went. Seed collections. Soil samples. Water records. Engineering diagrams. Botanical trials. Chemical formulas. Prototype systems for purification, restoration, and low-energy infrastructure. This was not war technology. It was survival technology. Rebuilding technology. The work of people who had looked at the instability of the 1940s and asked not how to dominate the future, but how to preserve it. Then she found the center table. There, in sealed cases, were the consortium papers and patents her father's journals had pointed toward, original filings, corporate documents, technical claims, and succession language. Elliot and 11 others had created a legally structured research consortium, and it had never been dissolved. Janet understood the truth all at once. The mountain was not hiding treasure. It was hiding inheritance. Janet came out of the forest on a Friday morning with dirt on her boots, a pack on her shoulders, and the kind of calm that only comes after certainty. Preston Cale was waiting on her porch. His silver sedan sat in the driveway like an insult, and he himself stood at the door with a legal briefcase in one hand and impatience arranged neatly across his face. He looked relieved when he saw her, then quickly reorganized that relief into condescension. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, stepping forward. "Your family's been concerned. 3 days with no contact. Good morning, Mr. Cale," Janet said, walking past him toward the door. "Would you like coffee?" That stopped him harder than anger would have. Inside, Janet set down her pack, washed her hands, and put on the kettle as though everything were perfectly ordinary. Then, with the quiet precision that had carried her through the forest and 30 years of preparation, she told him she would no longer be speaking to Harrow through him. He began with the word final. Final offer. Final chance. Final warning before legal options became less pleasant. Janet let him finish. Then she turned, looked him in the eye, and said, "I've had a very productive week. You should leave my property. My attorney will be in touch." Over the next several days, the legal confirmation came in. The consortium still existed. The patents still mattered. And Janet, through the succession language hidden in her father's documents, was the rightful inheritor of everything in that chamber. By the time Harrow understood what had changed, Janet was no longer a holdout. She was leverage. Janet chose the town hall on purpose. If Harrow Extraction was going to hear the truth, they were going to hear it in Mill Haven, under a roof their original development plan had quietly marked for demolition. The company's regional director arrived with lawyers, folders, and the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he was coming to close out a difficult but manageable problem. Preston Cale sat at his right hand. Janet sat across from them with her daughter-in-law, 2 legal specialists, and the brass compass placed on the table in front of her like a witness. Harrow opened with money. A bigger offer. Cleaner terms. Community incentives dressed up as generosity. Janet listened without interruption. Then her daughter-in-law slid the first packet across the table. Janet watched the room change. The regional director's expression shifted first from dismissal to concentration, then from concentration to the unmistakable stillness of a man recalculating power in real time. The patents were valid. The consortium still stood. The archive in the mountain was not folklore or eccentricity. It was enforceable intellectual property with modern commercial relevance. And Janet was not there to beg. She was there to redefine the conversation. When Harrow finished absorbing the legal reality, Janet made her proposal. No sale. No surrender. A licensing and development partnership built around Elliot Calloway's resonant extraction research, technology capable of lowering Harrow's costs while reducing environmental damage to the valley. They had intended to strip. That was the moment they understood. They had come to pressure an old woman into giving up land. Instead, they were being offered a future they did not own. The agreement did not happen quickly. It took months of legal review, patent evaluation, technical assessment, and negotiation sharp enough to cut through every vague promise Harrow had first arrived with. Janet did not rush any of it. She had waited 30 years to finish understanding her father's work. She could wait a few more months to make sure the future built from it was worthy of the wait. When the deal was finally signed, Mill Haven changed in ways both quiet and profound. Harrow withdrew its original demolition and extraction plan. The valley would not be gutted. The development footprint was reduced dramatically, and a restoration framework, one Janet insisted be written into the agreement, not spoken loosely over coffee, redirected a share of the value back into land stewardship and community infrastructure. The archive in the mountain was documented and protected. The seed collection was preserved. Eliot's work entered a new life, not as buried genius, but as active possibility. And Janet's family changed too. Not all at once. Not with dramatic apologies or perfect understanding. But the laughter stopped. Michael began listening differently. Daniel stopped speaking to her as if practicality always outranked wisdom. And Cora, especially, began showing up with a new kind of attention, slower, humbler, more curious. That mattered to Janet. Not because she needed vindication, but because it was good to watch someone young realize that certainty is not the same as insight. Millhaven had thought Janet was resisting the future. In truth, she had been protecting the only future worth having. By the end of it, Janet was still doing what she had always done. Walking the eastern edge of her land at first light. Checking the fence line. Feeling the morning air come down off the mountains. Keeping the brass compass in her pocket, not because she needed it to prove anything anymore, but because some instruments become part of the hand that carries them. The mountain had given up its secret. The town had changed. The company had recalculated. But the deepest truth of it all was simpler than any contract or patent. Janet had not won because she was louder than everyone else. She had won because she was patient longer. Because she trusted what she knew before anyone else was ready to respect it. Because she understood that age had not made her smaller. It had made her precise. That is what her story proves. Wisdom is not what remains after youth fades. It is what accumulates when a person spends decades paying attention, refusing panic, and learning the shape of truth beneath appearances. They laughed when Janet walked into the forest with that compass. They stopped laughing when she walked back out holding the future. And somewhere between those two moments, Millhaven learned what too many people forget: some women do not weaken with time. They sharpen. And when the moment finally comes, they know exactly where to walk.